Welcome, everyone. We're gonna, I believe Mackenzie is also going to show the slides, which are coming now. And I'm Leslie Orloff. I'm with the NUAP at American University Washington College of Law, and I'm very happy to invite everyone here today. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Office on Violence Against Women at the U.S. Department of Justice and the State Justice Institute and the National Judicial Network. I'm very excited about our topic today, which is identifying human trafficking and domestic violence, relationships and families. And we're going to talk about how we have HHS with us today, representatives from the Office on Trafficking in Persons, who are going to talk particularly about OTIP letters and certifications and the types of supports that come with them for survivors who are identified as victims of human trafficking. As I said, I'm Leslie Orloff. I direct NUAP, and I also staff the National Judicial Network. And I'll turn it over to Commissioner Young.
Hi, I'm Loretta Young. I'm a commissioner in Newcastle County Family Court in the state of Delaware. I've been doing SIJS orders, domestic violence orders, signing U visas, T visas, and working with Leslie for almost 8 or maybe 10 years.
Anna?
And I am Ana Isabel Vallejo. I am Assistant Dean of Experiential Learning and Administration at St. Thomas University College of Law. And I am also formerly representing immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking for a local NGO in Miami, Florida.
Lauren?
I can introduce Lauren and then we can test her sound in a moment. So I'm Elizabeth Mataro. I'm the Child Welfare and Protection Specialist at the Office on Trafficking in Persons. I'm joined by my colleague Lauren Devine, who's the Child Trafficking Prevention and Protection Coordinator at the Office on Trafficking in Persons. We're with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and we're here to talk today about benefits and services available to foreign national survivors of trafficking. Lauren, would you like to test your sound again?
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes, now we can.
Awesome. Great to be on with you.
This is sponsored by the Office on Violence Against Women and the State Justice Institute. The viewpoints you'll hear today are those of the faculty and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice and the State Justice Institute. I'm going to encourage you to use both the chat and the Q&A to ask your questions during this webinar. Encouraging you to ask questions as we go along. We're going to try to answer them as we go. So please, and then there'll be interactive opportunities as well. I just want to say that I want to invite those of you that are state court judges or to join our National Judicial Network. The link is in the slides. Commissioner Young, do you want to talk a little bit about the network?
Yes, we are a group that likes to educate other judges. And we also have peer-to-peer sessions and webinars on the first Tuesday of every month from 3 to 4. We have forums on human trafficking and immigration as it appears in state courts. We have 266 judicial officer members from 42 different states and U.S. territories. And our upcoming dates are November 7th and December 5th. Please join us.
Wonderful. And NUAP is involved in staffing the National Judicial Network. We also provide training and technical assistance nationally on all kinds of issues related to immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, child abuse. And so don't hesitate to contact us if you have further questions following the webinar. We also, in addition to having the community of practice for judges, you can join our community of practice for family lawyers. We have one for victim advocates and one for law enforcement and prosecution based, both staff, officers, and prosecutors. So to start, I thought we'd just quickly do a poll to get a sense of who's in the audience today. Mackenzie, can you show the poll? So let us know if you are a judge or court staff, victim advocate, an attorney, you're with law enforcement agency or prosecution agency. And those of you that are typing other, maybe you can tell us in the chat where you're from. I'm seeing a little over 50 or 60% of you. I'm going to share the results. And we have about 3% court staff, about a third of you are victim advocates or attorneys, each some law enforcement, and then 27% of you, it looks like clinicians, paralegals, interpreters, child welfare. So thank you all for joining us today.
By the end of this webinar, you're going to be better able to identify immigrant domestic violence and child abuse victims who are also victims of sex or labor trafficking. You will know how to report human trafficking occurring within families to OTIP. You'll be able to assist immigrant, domestic, and sexual violence victims who have suffered sex or labor trafficking in filing their requests for assistance with OTIP, and understand how identifying human trafficking occurring in families and intimate partner domestic violence relationships speeds up stabilization by giving them access to immigration relief, work authorization, and access to public benefits and other safety net services. Family trafficking. 2 in 5 trafficking cases reported annually to Federal Trafficking Task Force involve child sex trafficking. Over 62% of sex trafficked children, their trafficker is a family member, a parent, a guardian, aunt, uncle, with 45, almost 46% a parent or guardian. 65% of sex trafficked children may come as no surprise to you, come from unstable homes or compromised parenting. Almost 20% have a history of child abuse or neglect, and up to 34% of sex trafficked children are trafficked by an intimate partner. I don't think those stats come as a surprise to those of us who are working with families on a regular basis or who have some background in trafficking. It's always vulnerable populations that are targets of this activity. 82% female, 12 male, gender minorities, 6%. Most adults, 27% minors. Citizens and lawful permanent residents make up 43% of the victims, immigrants 57%. Type of trafficking, most is sex trafficking, 16% labor or and labor trafficking.
And those are national hotline statistics that I think are important to put this in context. What we're hoping people walk away here from this webinar is really knowing the importance of going the step further that it may take in a case of domestic violence or child abuse or other kinds of abuse occurring within families, particularly to identify trafficking victims. And so how might identifying survivors of trafficking that are either adults or children, how do you think your clients or the victims that you work with might benefit if they're identified as a trafficking victim, as opposed to just as a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence or child abuse? So I'm seeing in the chat, people are talking about processing times being faster for the U visa as opposed to the T visa. That's
No, the other way around, Leslie, for the
Oh,
T visa
T
as
visa.
opposed to the U visa.
sorry. And yeah, for the T visa opposed to, they can file for a T. Anna, feel free to jump in here and help me process this.
Yeah, most people are indicating, you can also get public benefits and access public benefits during the time of crisis once you have the T, so that helps the person get more stability. And also faster processing means faster work permit and faster route to getting the services that people need.
Exactly. And somebody did mention, that all the services that come with OTIP that HHS is going to be explaining later. Anything you want to add, Anna?
No,
Okay. And to just give you a picture of how this plays out, if you're able to identify a victim who would otherwise be eligible for a U visa, special immigrant juvenile status, or VAWA, self-petition, as a trafficking victim and help them access services from OTIP if they're children and or T visas and continued presence, you're talking about what can be at least 3 years, 3 to 5 years faster access to TANF, food stamps, public housing, and education, post-secondary educational grants and loans, for example, and significantly decades faster access for U visa victims and 3 years faster access for VAWA SIJS children. So it really can make a tremendous difference to the survivors you're working with. And we have a chart, we have a whole webinar on this that we can send you a link to, but you can click on this link and look up, because what somebody gets is going to vary by immigration status, whether they have an OTIP letter, and what state you're in and what benefits they need. So we've created tools that you can access through our public benefits map, where you can look up when you're working with a survivor and see if you identify them as a trafficking victim, what difference that makes in terms of benefits access in your state for that particular victim. Anna.
These are some examples of how trafficking cases present in court and how horrific the abuse victims are subject to. In the first case, oh, I'm sorry, it's Anna.
yes, that's okay.
Okay.
It's okay. But you know what? I'm happy that you mentioned that they present in court, because they do. And this is a great example. This is one example of how these cases present themselves in court or in a domestic violence setting. You had, and I just, as we were talking about these, I went back and reviewed the statements for my clients to see how it is that the cases had an intersection or how the cases were identified. The victim was coming to the United States. She was fleeing violent abuse from her father. She came from a country from Central America where her father had been sexually abusing her since she was 8 years old. She was now 18. She had already had a forced abortion, and the trafficker was her brother's boss. And he tells her that, she meets him over the phone. He tells her that there's an opportunity for her to come to work in his company and that he would help. Well, she starts planning her trip. She runs out of money during the time that she's coming to the United States. She gets intercepted by Mexican authorities and she's deported back to Guatemala. She doesn't want to go back to her home. So she calls the person who told her that they were going to help her. And she asked for help. And so he then arranges her trip back to the United States, pays for everything. She's intercepted by immigration authorities here and detained. He contacts an attorney for her and travels to Texas to pick her up once the attorney arranges for her to be released from detention. They stay at the attorney's home for one night, and then on their way to Florida, he rapes her and brings her down, takes her to see her brother for 10 minutes, and then takes her as a wife and locks her up in an apartment. What ensued were 7 years of domestic abuse. She had 3 children with him. He would take her to work, but he was constantly with her. So he even took her to work at the construction company while she was pregnant with her first child. 2 weeks after she had her second child, he took her back to work, never gave her a cent, and always had her locked up. He was also abusive to, I haven't finished. He was also abusive to the children. And in one of the beatings that he did for the kid went back to school, he told the kid to tell the teacher if they asked that it was the brother that had beaten him, but he told the teacher that his dad had beaten him. And that is how Child Protective gets involved. They don't identify the case as a trafficking case then just yet. There's another incident of domestic violence shortly after the case is disclosed to the teacher, and 911, and she calls 911, the police come. Eventually they arrest him and she is referred to the shelter. And then at the shelter, while she's receiving therapy, she discloses the relationship and how part of the abuse, in her eyes, part of the abuse was that he forced her to go work for him and that she didn't pay her. So the therapist identifies this case as a human trafficking case, and then thereafter the case starts being worked on as a human trafficking case. Next case. Next case. Yeah, there we go. So on the next case, we also have a situation where there's domestic violence. In this case, the victim had come to the United States on a work visa for a particular person, but ends up working at a friend's house of that person's. Not even, so she ends up not even working at the place where she thought she was going to come work. She's forced to work from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, and also sometimes till 11 o'clock when they were entertaining. She thought she was going to get paid $400 a month for taking care of 2 children, and it turned out that she ended up getting paid $200 to $100 a month, depending on what the woman in the house or the wife of her boss or the lady boss decided to pay her, and then they would tell her that they were going to be sending money back home for the rest of her pay. She wasn't allowed to go out except for go to church. So she meets her boyfriend at church, and it's through the boyfriend that she's able to escape because he helps her plan her exit. They began a relationship and he becomes abusive 6 months later into the relationship. She gets pregnant and he's again very physically violent and raped her on multiple occasions. In one of those occasions that he was violent, she calls the shelter and seeks help. Again, she gets referred for assistance as a victim of domestic violence and for help with her custody case. And it's not until we start asking about her migration history and what happened at her, in her employment, that she starts talking about what she had lived with and what her trafficking situation was like. I think it's important to include that when we were screening her for trafficking, our client disclosed to us that she had been not allowed to talk on the phone, that she had been threatened with the police, that she had been told that if she left, they would accuse her of stealing something. Her passport had been retained by the employers or the traffickers, and they had her living out of a garage. They controlled everything except for her ability to go to church. And so it became really important. You may have somebody who's referred to you under the guise of a victim of domestic violence. There's a case related to child abuse, but if you don't ask those questions related to the migration, you're not going to get the full picture of what this person has lived through. Next slide. And on this third case that I wanted to talk about, so we talked about 2 cases that there was domestic violence in them. In the first one, the trafficker was also her husband or abuser, and he forced her into labor trafficking. In the second case, we had a trafficking situation where the person ran away, met and was vulnerable, or the person who helps her run away becomes her boyfriend / abuser, and then she seeks help. So the trafficking is not related to, there's no trafficking that's related to the domestic violence in that case. And And then on the third case that I wanted to highlight for you, we have somebody who's Jamaican. She comes to the United States as a child. She lived with her parents who were abusive and ends up in the custody of the grandparents. Also, I need to highlight on this case that the abusive parents end up being killed, and she's in the custody of her grandparents and her auntie, who were also abusive to her, and her sister. She ends up running away. She meets a man at 13 years old, becomes romantically involved with that person, and that person ends up pimping her out and abusing her and punishing her if she refused to work as a prostitute. So she's a victim of domestic violence by the pimp. She's a victim of domestic violence at the hands of her grandparents. And she's also a victim of sexual violence. Ends up in sexual trafficking situation for 10 years, meets a boyfriend. And it's a type of control at that point, after the 10 years, where she had some freedom of movement between cities, but she still had to send money to her pimp. Ends up getting pregnant, escapes her pimp, has her child, and seeks help for under DACA, and ends up being referred to us because her DACA, when they do her fingerprints, they issue a request for more evidence. Immigration issues a request for more evidence for her in order to determine her DACA, and then a very long rap sheet comes up of all of the arrests that she had while she had been in a trafficking situation. When we start calculating her age and we look at the arrest, you can tell that she had been a victim of trafficking while she was underage. And therefore, that's how we were able to call the FBI and then begin an investigation in her case. Next. So there's different ways in which, and individuals end up contacting the system, but they may not even know that they're victims of trafficking. They may not even be thinking that there's a victim of trafficking. So you have here 3 different cases where there's sex trafficking, labor trafficking, domestic violence, sexual abuse. In all 3 cases, there had been sexual abuse at some point. And I'll go ahead and let Commissioner Young tell you a little bit more about the cross protection orders. And I have a comment about some of the cases that we had later on.
This is a case that I had in my courtroom years, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago. At first, I thought when I looked at it on the papers, oh, this is a domestic violence matter. So it's a US citizen married to a foreign national with a child in common. The wife's immigration status was pending. And I take a minute to recognize that sometimes, I asked her, like, do you know what your status is? No. And she had been like kind of pending forever. And she had no clue about the progress of her immigration case. And this is often used as a control technique by an abuser or trafficker. Wife filed a protection order, and she pled husband had held her captive in a hotel at knife point, and they had lived there for a temporary period of time, and that was at the time of filing. He regularly took all her money when she came home from work. So at this point, I'm thinking, this is some DV with probably looking at a U visa. Then he files a petition, a cross petition, and an answer, and pleads that his wife abandoned him. And he mimics some language from our divorce statute that, this is misconduct. And then says it reduced my lifestyle and caused me a loss of income. And as relief, he was asking for return of his economic losses, and he wanted a cell phone. The cross complaint really told the story and raised some serious red flags. So I was ready for this to go to trial. I called the victim advocate. I thought, we're going to get help for her. We're going to do, and they did not show up. Neither one showed up. And I didn't get that to go to court, go to trial, and I didn't capture any facts. So I had another PFA that we don't have a slide on, and it was an arranged marriage. Husband was a US citizen, wife was not. They resided with husband's parents. When husband would go to work, the mother-in-law would force wife to clean and cook all day. And if the mother-in-law went out, she would lock the wife in the basement. When husband would come home, mother-in-law would report on wife's, whether she completed her housework or not. And if she didn't, he would beat her. This was an excellent example of domestic violence within and labor trafficking. The victim successfully filed a T visa with the help of victim advocates and volunteer legal services. And this actually went to trial, and there was some very interesting testimony during the course of that trial. And mother-in-law was trying to intimidate her from the witness stand. When husband called her to the stand, she said, "Would it be so terrible if I killed a daughter-in-law who was disobedient?" And then she laughed, and everybody in the courtroom gasped. And she said, "I'm just kidding." But, it had a visible effect on wife. Traffickers have all kinds of different ways of accessing victims. And, basically it's fake jobs, fake relationships, smoke and mirrors, abuse, manipulation, control. They have all kinds of ways of making contact with victims. And, it's an unsuspecting and always a vulnerable victim. That's the door they're looking for, vulnerability.
And what's very interesting, and what I want to kind of summarize in the next few slides, the Department of Homeland Security has recently provided some policy guidance about what they're looking, so that will help identify how involuntary servitude, much as the cases that both Commissioner Young and Anna, Professor, discussed, Ana Vallejo, about, and they spell out how as a matter of immigration law, someone can qualify for a T visa or continued presence based on abuse occurring in family relationships. And they talk about using a scheme or a plan or a pattern intended to cause person to believe or forcing them into a condition where if they don't do what the trafficker wants, they would suffer serious physical harm, restraint, psychological harm, or abusive legal process. And we have here kind of slides out that summarize how these kinds of, how from the Department of Homeland Security's perspective, they adjudicate these involuntary servitude cases occurring in families. And so they'll look for the threat or the presence of injury. They'll look for restraint or somebody being held in servitude, and they'll recognize that it could be occurring through psychological abuse to establish the coercion.
I think, Leslie, if you
Please.
can stop for a minute, and
Sure.
it's really important to understand that there's no need to be there. There's no need for there to be physical violence. We're talking about cases where there is an intersection with domestic violence and sexual abuse. So we're highlighting how these cases are, but it's really important to note that there's no need for there to be physical violence. It could be a threat or abuse of the legal process, meaning like in the case that I highlighted, the fact that they would tell her that they would threaten her if she would be jailed because they were going to accuse her of stealing something, and also that she would be deported back. That is enough for us to be able to establish that there is some force or threaten or use of threat in order to get an involuntary servitude for immigration purposes. It's sometimes a little bit harder for the Department of Justice to bring a case forward, but it's really important to highlight there is no need for there to be physical abuse or physical restraint.
Yeah, absolutely. And they make that very clear in their policies and regulations. And so it could be domestic servitude, it could be exploitation, and it can happen in all kinds of parent, step-parent, intimate partner, extended family. You heard illustrations of all of this, where the motivation of the trafficker, if it's a labor case, is the condition of servitude. And really thinking about, and I think the cases you heard illustrate that people they feel coercion and they don't have their own liberty or self-determination. And the policies provide examples of how this can occur, including domestic labor at unreasonable levels, looking at working hours without regard to the health or the energy that somebody may have, not being able to control their own wages. These are examples of the kinds of unequal living arrangements that the Department of Homeland Security recognizes that are part of trafficking in families in these for immigration purposes. Anything else, Anna, on those that we need to highlight?
No, I think you covered it. It's really important to ask. Remember, I said one of the victims was living in a garage. Well, if you're living in a garage in Florida and the garage is not insulated and you don't have a bed and it's not a room, then you can start seeing how the living conditions are themselves coercive, or the situation where the person finds themselves in is not up to what it should be. And that's really what matters.
Mhm.
Go ahead. We could just go ahead with the poll.
So in light of the case scenarios that you're hearing about, have you worked with clients that you believe may have experienced human trafficking? And it looks like with about what percent we have, like just over half of you have responded. And it looks like many of you are saying, at least half of you are saying you're seeing both sex and labor, and many of you are seeing sex trafficking or labor trafficking, with only a minority saying that they haven't seen it at all. Okay. Commissioner Young, back to you. You're on mute.
These are the types of cases in our court that trafficking has been identified. Maybe not proven enough to go forward with the prosecution, but to identify a suspected trafficker. So sadly, this is almost every case type that our court handles. These are our statistical reports from our Anti-Trafficking Council. So you can see in 2022, we identified 21. We only have 3 counties in Delaware. Newcastle County is the northern county, more business and industrial. As you go further south to Kent, and then Sussex is more rural, and we have a lot of agriculture. What the data shows is that we're doing a better job of identifying trafficking victims, and we are identifying more victims. And we are also identifying that many of our victims are being trafficked by family members.
So Commissioner Young, go ahead.
We want to talk to you about the types of findings that judges want to include in their orders that might be helpful regarding human trafficking. I can't say enough about details. Orders that are rich in factual findings and law. So cite your state statute, capture the who, what, when, and where. And this is both for federal immigration purposes or at the state level for purposes of, and to assure that the child is safely placed. It's helpful to use either a bench card or to refer to that AMP model that the OTIP presenters are going to discuss with you. It may not be possible, keep in mind that to include every fact at the time that you hear the case. So some cases you have to accept that at the very least, your order is going to be a foundation upon which this case is going to be built or other orders will be built. Criminal cases, if you're making a finding beyond a reasonable doubt that trafficking occurred, then you're going to be able to include all of the details. You're issuing a criminal order and the burden of proof was the highest required. The standard in civil cases, it depends on the type of cases. You know, we might have PFAs that are by a preponderance, but then we may have substantiation hearings that placing someone on a registry, a child protection registry. And that would be a little bit lower standard. And this so you might be able to even though you can make your findings, you may or may not have all of the facts that you wanted to make a trafficking case. But, because of your training, you have your eye on the ball, where you want to move that. You want to be able to facilitate more investigation and more findings. And definitely you want to lay some foundation for victims to make filings with either OTIP or other immigration relief. So in some of those cases, you're writing an order that's going to be crucial. And this could actually make the trafficking case bloom for all to see. And as I said, assure placement of the child or keep the offender, who is at that point just a suspected trafficker, from having contact with other children.
Anna?
Okay, yeah, sorry. So when we're talking about what's available, for a T visa, victims of human trafficking are considered under immigration law. You have to show that the person falls under the definition of severe form of trafficking. And obviously that is somebody who either has provided sex or forced labor, right? And that service has been provided under force, fraud, or coercion. So sometimes the way that I like to think about it is, the person was compelled to provide sex or labor of any kind, and that includes sexual services. If the victim is under the age of 18, then there's no need to show force, fraud, or coercion for somebody who's a victim of sex trafficking or who has been forced to provide sex in exchange for anything of value. And that's important to keep in mind, because sex in exchange for anything of value could include sex in exchange for housing, sex in exchange for food, sex in exchange for a cell phone. So it's really important to talk to the survivor and find out what were the circumstances surrounding that sexual encounter, especially when we have, for example, vulnerable youth that are being offered a house or housing, and then they're told that they need to engage in sexual activity. They might not even realize that they're providing. Next, can you go back, please?
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Yes, it's okay. The person may not even realize that they are providing sex in exchange for something of value. So it's important to listen to how the person describes how it was that they ended up providing that sexual service. The person has to show that they're in the United States on account of human trafficking, which really means that the person either was brought in by their trafficker or is here because of the trafficking. And that could include because they're collaborating in an investigation or prosecution. Sometimes we may have situations in which the victim is able to escape, leaves to their home country, and then it's brought back by law enforcement. And there you have that because they're collaborating in an investigation or they're coming back to trial to testify. Those instances would also qualify on being in the United States on account of trafficking. But a victim who escapes, goes back to their home country, for example, and then comes back to the United States and there's no tie to the trafficking situation, might not be able to show that they're here in the United States on account of the trafficking. Unless the person is a victim of sex trafficking or underage, there is a requirement that the person comply with reasonable requests for law enforcement. And we don't have a definition of what's reasonable, but we do have a definition of what's unreasonable. And unreasonable is to request that somebody who has suffered significant psychological or physical trauma to collaborate in an investigation. So I can give you an example of a client who was a victim of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. He suffered in a labor context an electrocution. And whenever we came to talk to him, he would have pseudo seizures. There was nothing physically wrong with him, But the day before we tried to have any kind of interview with him, he would have a seizure. And so, and the interview couldn't happen. So it was unreasonable to continue requesting any kind of interviews with him because we were putting in danger his well-being, his physical well-being. The person also has to prove extreme hardship. And the good thing about the T visa is that you could get legal permanent resident status in the United States after 3 years of being in in a T visa status, or if the investigation is completed, then you can apply for a legal permanent resident status immediately after receiving your T visa. Next slide. And you can also petition for family members. You can go ahead and move to the next slide. I don't know. You go ahead.
Here. I think it's continued presence,
You
right?
want me to cover the continued presence?
Just
Yeah.
really quickly, and then we're going to turn it over to Chess.
Okay, perfect. So continued presence is a mechanism that's available to law enforcement. So sometimes you can file your T visa and that's going to move forward with the way it moves with USCIS, which is really maybe now 12 to 18 months before they get to adjudicate the TV. There is a mechanism under immigration law that allows the person to receive protection prior to the T visa being adjudicated, and that process is called continued presence. That process allows the victim to obtain a work permit and to get permission to remain in the country while the investigation or prosecution of a trafficking case is moving forward or is pending. It's important to highlight that there doesn't have to be a determination that person is 100% a victim. For continued presence, what is needed is that the law enforcement agency show that this person could be a potential witness and also a potential victim of human trafficking. So there's no need for there to be 100% set in stone that this victim is human trafficking. While they're sorting it out, this mechanism is available to allow that person to remain in the United States. The person can remain in the United States and have a work permit for a period of 2 years, and it could be renewed, but it's a mechanism that's controlled by law enforcement, and it's controlled by federal law enforcement, which means that mainly FBI or immigration and customs enforcement, the Office of Homeland Security Investigations will have to apply for continued presence at the request of at the request of a state agency that may be investigating human trafficking. So it's important to identify who's working in your state in the task force so that you can find out what the correct mechanism is or who the correct agency is that's going to apply for continued presence, depending on the type of case that you have. Then once the continued presence is granted, USCIS will notify headquarters and also will notify HHS so that the certification letter for the victim to access benefits can be issued. So it's a quicker way of getting the person to have status in the United States, be able to work, and also be able to access the benefits that they're entitled to under the law.
And so
Next, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in concluding this part, we're going to turn it over now to HHS and OTIP, and they're going to explain. So what's really important is that where children are identified under the age of 18, OTIP can issue eligibility letters, and they're going to talk to you about that in detail, which allows people to get benefits while their case, whether or not they ever file an immigration case, and if they do file, while they're waiting for the case to be adjudicated, they can receive access to benefits and services. Adults will need to go through to get something during the 18-month or so wait till they get their T visa. Adults will need to get continued presence in order to get an OTIP letter. I'm going to turn it over to HHS. It's going to explain this all to you a little bit more, but it is why identifying both adults and children as early as possible, whether you're a judge, a victim advocate, an attorney, is so important.
Before we turn it over real quick, because I saw something that I wanted to touch base on. Somebody asked whether there had been a lot of fraud cases related to trafficking in persons. And it's really hard because it does require that you have some kind of report to law enforcement. I have not seen very many cases where there have been fraudulent claims of being trafficked into the United States. More likely it's that people don't even identify the victim of trafficking because we're not looking for trafficking when we're talking to people who come across our services.
Okay, great. And I think that's a good point to turn it over to our faculty from OTIP who can help answer these questions that have been asked so far and enlighten all of us about the processes they have for identifying trafficking victims and helping them.
Thanks so much, Leslie. And thank you so much for having us. I'm hopeful that my sound will no longer cause problems like it was earlier. As mentioned before, my name is Lauren Devine, and I'm here with my colleague, Elizabeth Montaro. We are so grateful to be on with you today. What we're going to do, as Leslie just mentioned, is kind of talk through the process of both children and adults and how to connect them to benefits. So as adults need a continued presence or T visa from the Department of Homeland Security to get those refugee benefits from HHS, children, it's a completely different process. Starting in 2008, the reauthorization of the TVPA gave authority to HHS to make determinations for foreign national minors under the age of 18 and connect those children to benefits and services. So we have an entire separate process called the child eligibility process. We have our child protection team that reviews cases every day, and we're going to be talking about it more, but we receive in the last couple of years over 3,000 requests for assistance a year of potential trafficking on behalf of foreign national minors. So we're going to kind of talk about the trends that we see, the ways to look at cases, and how to get those cases to us. So with that, we will get started.
Lauren, I noticed your sound is being a little bit funky again. Are others hearing that?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, then I think I'll take the overview of OTIP and then I'll pass it back to Lauren in just a moment. So next slide, please.
Yeah. Do you guys want to go ahead and control your slides? I think it might
Oh,
help.
perfect. We are able to do that. Thanks so much, Leslie.
Sure, no problem.
Again, everyone, my name is Elizabeth. I'm so grateful to be here today. Thank you all for your engagement. And I think we're just so excited to talk a little bit more about our process. I know we don't have a lot of time, so we might go through this rather quickly, but we're going to provide a quick overview of our office, the process of understanding definitions and trends of trafficking among foreign national children and youth. We'll talk through the child eligibility process and coordination of services. Then we'll discuss the adult certification process and connection to benefits and services for adults, and we'll offer some resources and questions. So let's see. Next slide, Office on Trafficking in Persons. Now, our mission is to address human trafficking by supporting and leading systems that prevent trafficking and protect survivors, helping them rebuild their lives and become self-sufficient. Our team works on developing strategies, policies, programs to prevent trafficking, building capacity to respond to trafficking, increasing victim identification and access to services, and strengthening the health and well-being outcomes of individuals who have experienced trafficking. And we do that through 3 divisions in our office. We are part of, again, the Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, and we have 3 divisions in our team at OTIP: Protection, Prevention, and Research and Policy. Lauren and I are located in the Protection division, so we work on victim service and assistance activities, grant programs, the child eligibility and adult certification processes, which we'll discuss today, child victim coordination activities, and the National Human Trafficking Hotline. But we also offer training and technical assistance, survivor engagement, and other work through the Prevention department, and then division, and then we also have Research and Policy, where we do a lot of the identification, coordination, and implementation of anti-trafficking research, and we support program and policy development. We are going to spend a little time talking about that child eligibility process that Lauren mentioned and really dig into the definitions and trends. I saw a question earlier about how OTIP makes determinations for children, so we'll talk a bit about that. And before we get into it, we're going to show a brief video that provides an overview of the process. This video is 3 minutes long and just provides a kind of quick description of everything we're about to discuss. Let's see if we can get that to play. Perfect.
Human trafficking is a public health issue that affects children everywhere. Children may be forced to work in a restaurant, in construction, on a farm, in someone's home, or other locations. They may be made to have sex in exchange for food, shelter, or to pay off a debt. Every child's story is different. In 2000, Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA, which protects all children living in the United States who have experienced trafficking, including those who were born in other countries. Through the TVPA as amended, foreign national minors who experience human trafficking can receive assistance. This assistance is made possible through an eligibility letter from our office, the Office on Trafficking in Persons, which is located within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. With this letter, children can apply for benefits and services such as Medicaid, food assistance, cash assistance, foster care, and other needs to the same extent as refugees. If you know of a foreign national minor who may have experienced human trafficking at any point in their life, before or after arriving in the United States, you can submit a request for assistance, or RFA, through Shepherd, our secure online case management system. Anyone can submit an RFA on behalf of a child, including child welfare workers, case managers, teachers, counselors, doctors, nurses, attorneys, law enforcement officers, or other advocates. The TVPA requires federal, state, and local officials to report trafficking concerns involving a foreign national minor to our office within 24 hours of discovering a potential trafficking situation. Once a person submits an RFA, our office will review the request and contact them. We may also connect the child to a case manager to receive trafficking-specific comprehensive case management services in order to support the child and their family. After we evaluate the RFA, there are 3 possible outcomes. We determine that the child has experienced human trafficking and we issue an eligibility letter. We require more information to make a determination, so we issue an interim assistance letter to allow our office more time to review the case and consult with other organizations. We determine that there is not information indicating forced labor or commercial sex and issue a denial. If you learn new or clarifying information about a potential trafficking experience, you can always submit a new request on the child's behalf. After receiving an eligibility or interim assistance letter, the child can apply for benefits and services with the help of their case manager, family member, or other adult. If you have questions about the child eligibility process or whether you should submit an RFA, contact us at childtrafficking@acf.hhs.gov or 202-205-4582. Thank you for learning about the child eligibility process. Together, we can assist survivors and help end child trafficking. To access the Shepherd Case Management System, visit acf.hhs.gov/OTIP/victim-assistance/Shepherd.
All right, let's see if my sound is working now. Any better, everyone? Or are we okay?
Better.
Awesome. Fingers crossed it stays this way. Otherwise, Elizabeth will be a great facilitator for the entirety. Great. I see those thumbs up. Hopefully moving forward, we are good to go. Again, it's great to be on with you. And one thing I wanted to just highlight too before we get into these definitions is really understanding the reason we want to talk through these definitions is because at HHS, we're able to assess and issue benefits to foreign national minors, even if it's a case that may not be able to be fully investigated by law enforcement. Maybe there's not sufficient evidence for some reason, but you do know that there is potential trafficking concerns. The other thing to be aware of is that trafficking doesn't have to have any nexus to the United States. So that's very different than what was being talked about earlier in regards to a T visa or continued presence. So a child can tell you that 10 years ago in Honduras, they were forced to work, or 5 years ago in Mexico, they were asked to have sex in exchange for something of value. We can get that case and issue benefits to that child as a victim of a severe form of trafficking, regardless of the nexus to the United States. I really wanted to highlight that for you because it may be something that you could pass along to us that you might not be able to pursue that continued presence or immigration status through T visa. So when we're looking at definitions as an office, we're looking at it from the perspective of 22 U.S. Code 7102. And what we're trying to assess is, can we demonstrate
that a child experienced either labor trafficking or sex trafficking as defined in the law. I do see a question that says, but they still need to be a child at the age of contact. Correct. So we'll talk about that process in just a bit in terms of the administrative process, but yes, so long as we get the case before the child's 18th birthday, we can absolutely connect that child to benefits and services. If it's after their 18th birthday, we can still connect them to case management services who can then work with an attorney and others and get that individual, that adult connected to a T visa or other supportive services. And so we'll actually be talking about that adult certification process a little bit later, but that's a great question. Okay, the first thing I just want to lay out the difference between and kind of talk about how we look at cases is the difference between trafficking and smuggling. As you all know on this call, smuggling is that transportation, that movement from one country to another, where trafficking is that forced labor or commercial sex. If we receive a case, and we call them requests for assistance, if we receive a request for assistance on behalf of a foreign national minor, that there was potential forced labor or commercial sex is the reason they were smuggled into the United States, we could issue a letter. If there's demonstration that during their smuggling experience, they were forced to work, or maybe the guide says, you have to have sex with me in exchange for something of value, that could be, or in exchange for the cost of the journey, that would be something that we could issue a letter for. Or let's say the child is coming into the United States, they get into the US Department of Health and Human Services custody at the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they're in a shelter, and they're talking to their case manager, and it's come to find out that child is being threatened by the individual that they came to go live with. They don't know this person, and that person is threatening them and saying, I'm going to harm you and your family if you don't come to my home and work for me. Even if the child doesn't get there to that home and work for that individual, we would have enough information to demonstrate that child was potentially smuggled to the United States for the purpose of forced labor. So even if the forced labor or commercial sex don't occur, if we can demonstrate that the child was smuggled or transported here for that purpose, we can still connect them to benefits and supportive services. And one thing I'll say a lot, but if when in doubt, honestly, just send the case our way. We would rather get 100 cases and one of them be trafficking and deny 99 of them than not get that one case. So when in doubt, send it our way. We also have a child protection team that is incredible, and they get calls and case staffings all day. So you can also reach out and say, I'm not sure if this case is trafficking or not. And we can help talk through that with you and help guide you through submitting that case. So we'll make sure to put the case staffing phone line in the chat, but I also just want to highlight that it is in the slide deck, and we'll make sure that you get that before the end of the presentation. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the difference between trafficking and ransom. And Anna, if you want to come in and share a little bit about the case that you ran into. The reason we'd like to talk about these cases that are, or these situations that are different, but still highlight them, is because often in situations of ransom, we see that children also experience trafficking. So if while the child is held for extortion or ransom and they are forced to work, they're asked to have sex in exchange for the cost of the ransom, for example, those would be cases of trafficking. And so we always want to highlight these things to demonstrate that something they may initially present as ransom could also fall into that category. So Anna, I'll pass it to you. I know you had a case that you wanted to highlight.
Yes, and this is really important because sometimes you do have a situation like that. And I had a case dealing with adults, but it's pretty much goes like this. The person is offered a job to come into the United States. We're going to help you with crossing you over. And then when they are crossed over, they are held at a safe house and told that they need to pay more money. Now, this is 3 people. One's a couple, and then another person that had nothing to do with this. But eventually the couple is able to raise money to get one of the persons out. And they decided together that he was going to leave because he was going to probably be able to work and make money faster to get the wife out. While this happened, so he goes and he starts working to send money to the smugglers. They're told, if you cook and clean, you can pay your debt sooner. So now they're made to cook and clean for all of the other groups that are coming in through the smugglers that are coming into these safe houses. But then as well, the women are also beaten and abused sexually. Some of them are forced to engage in a romantic relationship with one of the smugglers so that they don't have to have sex with everybody else. So in long story short, in that case, you can see because they're also forced to cook and clean, and there's physical restraint and physical abuse, that also turned into, there's a ransom, but there's also, it turns into a trafficking case when you're forcing that person to work off that debt.
Thank you so much. And yeah, a lot of times we see those dual purpose situations. And a lot of times also, someone may say, oh, well, the child was harbored for the purpose of ransom, not the cleaning and the cooking. But what we can demonstrate is that while the child was harbored for ransom, in that example that you just gave, the child was then recruited for the purpose of the cleaning and cooking. So we can still demonstrate that labor scheme within the ransom. Again, when in doubt, send it our way. We don't need you to figure out every little piece and component before passing it to us. At the end of the day, we just want to get that child connected to supportive services while we figure things out. So thank you so much for that example. It's really helpful to just really highlight how these cases can look. Another slide we really want to highlight, and we've really been getting a lot of questions around this in particular lately, as individuals are trying to assess situations of child labor exploitation versus trafficking. A lot of state child welfare systems, for example, are grappling with how to assess situations of child labor and labor trafficking. And when is child labor a situation that is considered exploitation, and when is it considered trafficking, and when is it considered voluntary, and trying to kind of understand all of those things. So we've really been in a lot of conversations, and something that's helpful is to kind of think about it in the standpoint of, if the child is sensing or perceiving a sense of being exploited in the work or the service or the labor, even if it's one time. So someone asks them to sell drugs on one occasion and they're forced to sell the drugs and they're threatened to be harmed. Even if they did it one time and they perceived sense of threat, they perceived that they didn't have a choice, that would be a case to send our way to foreign national minor. So even though you don't know for sure if it's trafficking or not, we would say if there seems some kind of perception, or if you, as the individual learning about it, perceives that there was some type of intimidation, control, coercion related to the work, pass it along, and we can kind of parse it out. So labor exploitation examples could be, maybe the child is not paid what they're promised, maybe they have pay withheld, they don't know how much they're earning, they don't get meal breaks, they're working in a really unsafe situation. Maybe it's hazardous work environments, maybe they're working in a factory that's unsafe. And then as it gets more into that trafficking situations, we see instances of the child being controlled, their movements are controlled, they're receiving threats related to debt or expenses, either it's from the employer, a family member, someone in their home country, a friend, a family member, a neighbor. Maybe they're being threatened with deportation, or they're intimidated, or made to feel in some sense that they have no choice related to the work. So again, you all don't need to figure out if it's exploitation or trafficking in terms of benefits and services. Really, if you have those flags, those concerns that this feels exploitative, and there's some kind of a labor practice or service associated, definitely send it our way. So when we're looking at the definitions in 22 U.S. Code 7102, when we're looking at labor trafficking, we really have to parse out that action means purpose model. And earlier, someone mentioned the AMP model. So sometimes people call this the AMP model. So an example of how we would use this would be, for example, if a child is walked up to by an individual and told, you have to work, or you have to sell these drugs, or I'm going to kill your family. So the child sells the drugs. We would say the action is recruiting, the means is coercion, because the child and their family were threatened to be killed, and the purpose would be involuntary servitude. Another example is if that earlier example of the child coming to the United States, they don't actually work, but they're being threatened related to the work they were going to perform. Their family's being threatened to be killed by an individual related to that work. We could potentially say the action was transporting. The means was coercion, because they're being threatened for the purpose of, and we would say peonage is labor associated with a debt with threat of harm, and then involuntary servitude. So even though they haven't actually worked, we can show that scheme was happening. So that's how our child team looks at these cases to assess whether the child is eligible for benefits. And then, of course, sex trafficking. Because we're talking about minors right now, there doesn't need to be any forced fraud or coercion. So for adults, we would have in that middle rectangle, it would say means and it would say forced fraud and coercion. But for minors, we don't need to have that. And we also don't need to demonstrate that the sex act or exchange actually occurred. We just need to show that the action and the purpose happens. If a child is told, I'll pay you $50 to have sex with me, we would say that child was solicited for commercial sex. If the child actually engaged in that sex act, we would say that the child was then recruited for commercial sex. Harboring would be the child was held in some way or confined. Transporting, the child was transported. Provided, someone provided the child out to a third party. Obtained, the child was grabbed in some way. And then solicited is that ask or offer of something of value for sex. And then patronizing is a third party. So an example of patronizing would be a landlord tells a grandparent, if you let me have sex with your grandchild, your rent and your utilities will be paid for. So there's some kind of third party that child themselves is not receiving or being offered that's something of value. When we're looking at sex trafficking for our cases, we assess whether there's something of value occurred. And so we're looking at money, food, shelter, gifts, transportation, something that is commercial in nature. We look at sexual act as defined in 18 U.S. Code 2246. So that's oral, anal, vaginal sex, digital penetration, or touching underneath the clothing in the genital region. And with sexual act, we don't need all of those details. So Elizabeth will be talking about this in just a moment, but really we just need to be able to demonstrate that there's potential trafficking. So there's this federal law that Elizabeth will also be talking about in regards to our process and was highlighted in that video that says if you have concerns of potential trafficking, to pass that case along to us. So if you have concerns that maybe the child engages within a sexual act for something of value, but you're not totally sure, that is totally sufficient, and we can work with you to assess that case. Also looking at child sexual abuse material, we look to assess whether there is a sex act in exchange for something of value. And then again, solicitation alone is sufficient to indicate that a child has engaged in commercial sex or has been induced. These are just breaking down the actions and what they mean. I won't go into these in detail because of just time constraints, but you will get these slides and this will be available to you so that you can look at these in further detail. And also, if you have any questions about any of this, please reach out to us. Means, we say force is physical, coercion is psychological, fraud, deception. And for minors, this would only apply to labor trafficking. And then for adults, it would also apply to sex trafficking. Purposes, the main thing I want to highlight here is in regards to the initial conversation around interpersonal violence and domestic violence, we can also demonstrate involuntary sexual servitude as a form of labor trafficking. So if we demonstrate that a child was held and forced to engage in sex acts, even if they didn't perform chores, even if they didn't perform that construction that was in that example earlier, but they were forced to engage in sex acts over and over, and there's some sense of servitude in that, we could demonstrate that child is a victim of labor trafficking, regardless of, there being a typical type of labor that you typically think of. So really wanting to highlight, if you have cases of potential interpersonal violence or domestic violence for a foreign national minor, definitely send that case our way so we can assess if they're also eligible for trafficking benefits. Some trends that we often see among foreign national children: commercial sex and smuggling cases, domestic and sexual servitude, what I was just highlighting. We see a lot of forced criminality where children are forced to perform labor or services that are criminal in nature. We see a lot of forced labor and smuggling where children are forced to work by an individual connected to their smuggling situation, often to pay off a debt or some kind of other expenses. Like was highlighted earlier, we do see a lot of cases related to trafficking in the family context, interfamilial trafficking, particularly also seeing this in the form of labor trafficking. And then we do see a lot of forced labor on journey, whether it's when the child is held for ransom or extortion or kidnapping or other type of exploitation that occurs on their journey to the United States. So these are some examples of forced criminality that we often see in cases. And we wanted to highlight this because often we don't think of forced criminality in the context of trafficking. And we've been getting more and more questions around this and just wanted to highlight some of the trends that we see related. We see a lot of cases where children are forced to distribute, transport, or sell drugs, and they're threatened for harm for noncompliance. We see a lot of cases where children are forced to stand guard or monitor for gang members. A lot of times they're made to be foot guides, or they're made to pull out pull out rent or toll or quota from community members. Almost they're made to extort in some ways other individuals. And in all of these cases, it can be really hard initially for the purposes of screening and assessment. Sometimes a child may present as to the service provider or an individual as, quote, a gang member. They may say, oh yeah, I am in a gang. And as the child builds rapport and builds trust with that individual, it comes to find out that they were forced to be in that gang, or they had no choice and they were forced to do these acts with threat of harm for noncompliance. It can get really complicated in understanding these dynamics. And so something to just kind of be thinking about in cases of forced criminality. If you're not sure if it's a case of trafficking, definitely feel free to pass it along to us. And I do see a couple of questions. And so I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Elizabeth, to answer those questions that are in the chat and Q&A and flag anything else you wanted to highlight.
Thanks, Lauren. We had two specific questions related to forced criminality. One of them is regarding the minor being charged at the state or local level on drug charges for selling, possession, etc., but was forced to do so by the smuggler or trafficker. Does this compromise the chance for benefits? And then similarly, have we seen T visa approvals in the forced criminality context?
Those are really great questions. So for the first question, for the purposes of benefits and services, the law doesn't restrict us from being able to issue benefits to a child that does have charges or the example that you gave. So if you have concerns that that child was forced to engage in those acts, definitely send that case to us and we can assess whether it meets the definition of labor trafficking that we went through. Absolutely. In regards to T visa approvals in the forced criminality context, I don't have that information, but I think that would be a really good inquiry to pass along to USCIS and better understand. But I think that's a great question. And I'm sorry, since we don't issue those T visas, I don't necessarily have that information, but that is a great question. And I'm curious as well.
And let me just say, maybe Anna, you and I can jump in on this, but there are a number of waivers available to trafficking victims particularly when it's connected to the trafficking for the immigration case. Anna, did I get that right?
Yes, actually you did. And I have my camera off momentarily because I was losing signal. But yes, there are specific waivers available. And if you can show also that the person, the issue here, I think, is going to be the discretion. And you need to show that the survivor is going to merit discretion or favorable discretion in determining the T visa. So you want to include in that person's statement all of the equities that were that make that person not a criminal, right? That this is forced criminality. They're not. It's not that they were a gang member, but that they were forced to be a gang member. I think in the context of sex trafficking, it's a little bit easier to get those cases approved. I've had some cases that have been a little bit harder to get approved, especially when I'm talking about when I have cases of individuals who are transgender engaged in the sex industry. So that becomes a little bit harder, but really what you want to do is show the equities and the need for the assistance here in the United States and maybe the threat that person would be suffering back in the home country, and the fact that if they were to be deported, they would not be able to continue collaborating with law enforcement if there's an investigation or prosecution pending.
Great. Let's get it back to HHS because I'm concerned about time. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren and Leslie. So I'm going to move on to talking about our child eligibility process and how to take all that information that you just learned from Lauren and put it into a request for assistance for our office. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as Lauren was discussing before, the TVPA of 2000 as amended, requires all federal, state, and local officials to report potential trafficking concerns on behalf of foreign national minors, including unaccompanied children, to our office within 24 hours. So any foreign national minor under the age of 18 should have a case submitted to our office within 24 hours. If it's been more than 24 hours, we will still accept the case up until their 18th birthday. So please don't let that be a barrier for submitting it to us. As long as it's up until their 18th birthday, local time, we can accept the case. And then upon receipt of credible information that a foreign national minor experienced human trafficking, we will issue what's called an eligibility letter, pictured here on the right, to the child, making them eligible to apply for benefits and services to the same extent as a refugee. As Lauren mentioned, this is a process that's completely separate from the legal immigration process. And so we really strongly recommend it for children that you're encountering that might meet any of the criteria that was previously defined in the previous slides. Again, we recommend also reporting locally to your child protective services and other reporting requirements in addition to reporting to our office. And then the way the process works is that if an individual, so you or whoever is working most closely with or on behalf of the child, has concerns that a foreign national minor may have experienced forced labor or commercial sex, again, at any country or at any point in their lives. It does not have to have that nexus to the United States that we were discussing before. That individual submits a request for assistance on the minor's behalf in Shepherd, OTIP's online case management system, and we'll send the information for how to access Shepherd and include that in the slides when we send it out later, within 24 hours of identifying the potential concerns. And then our team here at OTIP will review the case, correspond with the requester, and assess based on that AMP model that Lauren described before, whether the minor experienced trafficking in accordance with the TVPA. And if we determine that the minor has experienced trafficking, an eligibility letter will be issued, or what's called an interim assistance letter that provides benefits and services for up to 120 days can be issued. And then the child will be referred to case management services. One question is, every state have an OTIP office, and it's a federal office, so we will process cases for all 50 states. These are the 3 determination types. Eligibility never expires once it's issued, including after they turn 18, they can use that letter to access benefits. And then interim assistance is when we're gathering more information. So if you have a case that you don't have all the facts about yet, and you think, hey, I think this might be trafficking. I've called the child protection line at OTIP and they said they'd like to submit it. They might need more information. You can submit that case and we might issue what's called interim assistance to provide support for up to 120 days to help get that child access to benefits and critical support while we're assessing the case. And then if the information provided does not indicate trafficking, for example, a ransom case that doesn't include forced labor or a smuggling case, we will issue a denial. But if at any point there's new information about the trafficking experience, the requester or anyone else can submit a new request for assistance on the child's behalf as long as we receive it before the child's 18th birthday. And this is Shepherd. This is what it looks like. So we, again, will make sure you have the link to submit the case in Shepherd, but it's on our website and will be included in the information we send out after this. You go to add child request and it'll take you to just a quick online form that's confidential and secure that will just come to our office, and we'll process the case through Shepherd. This is the process, and this here, the child trafficking at acf.hhs.gov email on the right, is how you can reach our child trafficking team, child protection team. So if you have any questions at all about the process, you want to know more, you want to staff a case, you can call this phone number 202-205-4582 or send us an email. And we can help kind of guide you through that process, but you can also, again, create an account in Shepherd, submit that request to us, and check your email for updates. A lot of the communication will happen through Shepherd once you submit a case. These are the types of benefits that children are eligible for. This is an example of some of the benefits that's not limited to this, but essentially immigration status would no longer be a barrier to accessing these types of benefits in certain states. Every state is different, and so we recommend that you look into resources in your area or reach out to our grant program, Aspire, for more information. But this is an example. Children can access refugee cash assistance in some states, or TANF, food stamps, Medicaid, which can help access mental health resources. They can also access refugee services, programs like Preferred Communities that provide case management that's specific for individuals experiencing mental health concerns or medical concerns. It can be very helpful in accessing further services for children in need. Our grantee is called Aspire through the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and they have a model that includes regional coordinators based around the country. And so each regional coordinator will provide kind of specialized technical assistance and guidance. If you're working in a particular region and you'd like to get in contact with them, we can put the general contact information for Aspire in the chat, but also when you submit a case to our office through Shepherd, we'll connect you directly with Aspire to help ensure that the child's case management needs are being met. And in some cases, Aspire can also provide financial assistance. I'm going to move quickly through this to make sure that we have time to talk quickly about the adult certification process. But just to show you, we've been receiving substantially more requests and issuing eligibility letters in recent years, just due to increasing awareness about this process. In fiscal year 2022, we issued 2,226 eligibility letters, 73% for labor trafficking, 23% sex, and 4% both, and mostly for teenagers, but also young children. Again, resources will be sent out after the training. And I'm going to talk very quickly about this adult certification process, just so that we all have a bit more understanding. So adult certification process is quite different than the child eligibility process in that it An adult must receive an approved T1 visa or continued presence in order to receive that certification letter. So they have to be working with an attorney and have gone through that process, or they could have applied on their own, but have to have been pursuing that, received that approved T visa or continued presence in order to access the benefits that children are eligible for with just the letter. But with that letter, they can access the same benefits that children can with the eligibility letter. An adult without that T visa or continued presence, but that has experienced those potential trafficking concerns, can be referred to the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, or TVAP, which operates like Aspire, but for adults, for case management and services while they're pursuing the T visa. The process is that OTIP will receive a T visa or continued presence from the Department of Homeland Security in Shepherd. OTIP will email the attorney on record or victim assistance specialist or victim witness coordinator to notify the T visa or continued presence recipient that they can receive a certification letter and information on how to request the letter or case management. The requester will submit a new request in Shepherd, the adult request rather than a child request, and indicate if case management or a certification letter is being requested, and OTIP processes the request in Shepherd. Once the certification letter is issued, the requester receives an email that the PDF version is available to download in Shepherd, and a hard copy is mailed out to the address provided in the request. The hard copy of the letter will be needed to access benefits. There are some benefits that are time sensitive once a letter is issued, including that refugee cash assistance and refugee medical assistance. So make sure that the client is wanting that letter and is ready to apply for benefits when the letter is requested. And it can be requested at any point before the T visa or continued presence expires. Only a T1 visa recipient will receive a certification letter. Derivative visa holders can apply for benefits with their derivative visa. And if an eligibility letter was received when the adult was a child, they will not receive a certification letter as an adult. The eligibility letter can still be used when they are an adult. Again, same type of access to benefits here. TVAP is kind of the adult version of Aspire, but for that same requirement as needing to be pursuing the T visa or continued presence. And then adult certification letters issued is more related to USCIS's processing of T visas and trends around continued presence. So the numbers are a bit different than the eligibility process. And these are adult certification trends that we will again send out. So I know there are a lot of questions in the chat. I will pause there. We only have a couple minutes. So Leslie, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I think one of the questions, I think you answered it actually. So I just want to reiterate, I know this is a lot of information. We will have all these materials and resources online for people. But I think the takeaway here is for those of us that are working with domestic violence and child abuse victims, there are huge advantages to reporting those cases as early as possible, particularly for minors, to HHS's OTIP program. And you can use our web library to find out how that will affect benefits in each state. I want to ask you to please fill out the evaluation for this training. Tell us what you want to learn more about, and we'll do everything we can to provide you further information on this important topic and to support you. And whether you're a judge, a law enforcement official, working in prosecution, a victim advocate or attorney, and encourage you to identify trafficking wherever it is occurring, because it can make a tremendous difference in terms of services, support, and timing of everything that is available to the trafficking victims that you're able to identify. So thank you so much to the OTIP staff, to Lauren and Elizabeth, to the NCJ, FCJ staff who've supported us today. And I know this is a lot of information, but that's why we'll make the recording available, and let us know what more you want to learn in the future. And we will see if maybe we can get Lauren and Elizabeth back to join us with more details in the future. Thank you again for all the work you're doing. Thank you, Commissioner Young, as well, and to Professor Vallejo for sharing your expertise today.
Thank you, Leslie, for this opportunity.
Well, it's great to be here.
Thank you.